I'm sure you're aware there's an election coming up in like
Yes.
9 weeks.
Yes.
In fact, it's 62 days, I think, as of
Yes.
yesterday. I calculated 63 days as 6 weeks, but I've been corrected with some basic math. Um, your sense of like, there's been a lot happening. We haven't spoken since we have a new candidate. Where are you on like where Harris is at this point? Because it definitely feels to me like there has been there's been this sort of race to the center in some way. But we were talking just beforehand, fracking. We're just talking about like the best thing that Biden did, as far as I'm concerned, probably during his administration, was to freeze permits on these LNG export facilities. That moratorium was enjoined by a court with a Trump appointee judge. No surprise. The Energy Department is appealing that court's ruling to overturn the moratorium. But the Energy Department just granted a 5-year license yesterday to New Fortress Energy. 5 years doesn't allow for as long of a long-term investment in this, but it is not a good sign. Like, what's your perspective on this race at this point?
I think that Kamala Harris is obviously trying to run on vibes. It's kind of a cliche, but I think there's something to the idea of essentially, if it's a short run, that you just try to run on, I'm not Trump, I'm not Biden, in the sense of I'm not old, I can actually do the job. And so I think they're clearly trying to be somewhat vague. And by the way, I think part of their takeaway from Project 2025, I don't think it's the right takeaway, is that the political problem of Project 2025 is that it's 900 pages of detailed policies, when in fact I think the real problem of Project 2025 is that it's an extremist document. In other words, I think they're taking away the idea that any policies put out there creates political vulnerabilities. So as Project 2025 seems to prove with Trump, but I think the takeaway is no, put out some basic policies that aren't extremist, that are popular. And what I worry about, Sam, with Kamala Harris, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, is that I think, in a sense, her political reflexes are actually decent. That we have a historical record of her articulating compelling positions initially from the heart. I think back to Medicare for All in 2019. She offered at that CNN town hall when she was running for president one of the most articulate cases for Medicare for All I'd ever heard. Arguably more articulate than Bernie Sanders. She talked about insurance, et cetera, et cetera. I think the problem is that what she then has tended to do on a lot of issues is kind of then spend a long time backtracking the minute there is pushback. You saw that with the price gouging proposal. Her campaign was going to put out this anti-price gouging thing. A lot of corporations, a lot of the elite media didn't like it. She sort of dialed back the rhetoric, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that what oftentimes we're looking for in presidential candidates, or what the campaign tests, is not whether you can put out a positive vision with specific policies. It's whether you can handle the heat that comes with it. Can you manage the attacks that will come in, the efforts to scandalize what you're pushing? And that's where I worry about Kamala Harris. And I think Donald Trump understands that. That's why he, in part, is trying to throw everything in the kitchen sink at Harris, hoping that she's going to essentially fumble all of this, right? I mean, that's what the campaign actually tests. Can you handle the heat? So what I think the Democratic convention, I think Harris built up a lot of momentum. It was impressive in the sense of the choreography of it, the her becoming the nominee, et cetera, like politically impressive. I mean, I got some problems with the fact that, from a small d democracy perspective, there weren't votes cast or whatever, but political choreography, it was, I think, effective. But now is where things can move around a lot. Like on this debate stage next week, Donald Trump definitely has thought of like 5 or 10 different ways to attack her in a way that gets her to look like she can't handle the heat, that she's going to backtrack. She's going to talk about it.
I'm going to call her Kamala. I'm going to
Kamala.
I'm gonna say like, I smell curry. What's that? What is going on here? Like, but all right. So wait. So is your analysis? Is the analysis that you're making in terms of like? And I think you're right. She has done just about everything you can do to try and make sure that this is as much a referendum on Donald Trump as anything, as opposed to, which I think is probably a good strategy. And certainly the fact that like, Joe Biden's favorability ratings are up now that he's out of the race, that the day that she comes in, the polls all radically sort of like shift. I mean, not, by no means is would I bet my kids' college education on it, but the polls shift just by virtue of there not being a deficit on the Democratic ticket or a perceived deficit. So their strategy is like, don't do anything that's going to draw too much attention to us. Is your assessment, are you worried about that as a political matter in terms of like the election? Or do you worry about that as a matter of, if she wins, what are we going to get after that?
Well, I think it's both. I think it's that if you're not campaigning on much of anything, your opponent can try to make that an issue, right? That answer in her first interview with Dana Bash on CNN, where Dana Bash was like, what do you want to do on day one? And she really didn't have much of an answer. I mean, I don't think it was catastrophic yet, but Ted Kennedy, when he was trying to run a primary against Jimmy Carter, what effectively killed his campaign was he was asked a similar question. Why do you want to be president? And he wasn't able to articulate much of an answer. Now, again, maybe you can get away with that for 60 days, right? Like maybe you can.
Right.
And who am I to say, you can't? But there is a danger in being so focused on campaigning on nothing and making it a referendum on your opponent that it starts to become a referendum on whether you have any agenda at all. I also definitely worry about the what I would call the Jimmy Carter dynamic. There's a fascinating podcast called Blowback by a reporter named Ben Bradford, who traces how in 1976 Jimmy Carter ran for president, aggressively trying to not define much of a policy platform at all. I mean, it was like the original Vibes campaign. And he eked out an election against Gerald Ford. I mean, he barely won, but he won. But part of the problem was that in campaigning on basically not very much, it created a mandate for an incredibly directionless administration, right, which then 4 years later, that directionlessness was created an opportunity for somebody who was campaigning on a very clear agenda, Ronald Reagan. And what I worry about longer term, and I know some people are going to be saying, just focus on winning the, and I get it, just focus on winning this election right now. But what I worry about like a little longer term is that a Republican Party without Trump removes the glue that keeps the Democrats together, right? Trump is a gift in a sense to the Democratic Party in that they can organize around being against him. He loses, Kamala wins with sort of a not really a clear mandate about what she's going to do, what she wants to do. And then a Republican Party without Trump 4 years later sends up people like a Josh Hawley or somebody of that ilk who seems like who is an ideologue, who is potentially more appealing than Donald Trump. And we have a redux of the 76 to 1980 situation. Again, I know people say, well, that, just worry about that in, later on. Let's just focus on this election. But 4 years from now, that's what I would worry about.
Yeah, that's an interesting dilemma. I mean, you could argue that sort of the organizing principle of the Biden administration, and let's put aside foreign policy for a moment, because I think I think you also have similar real problems with what's going on with our support of Israel.
Yeah.
But you could argue that from a Biden perspective, like, the labor and antitrust and the sort of like the industrial policy, there's an organizing principle to the
Yes.
Biden administration. Now, I'm not sure he necessarily ran on that. It was a very weird era, period. But he also, I think people thought we were getting something that was frankly more conservative than that. Because he had a 50-year history in the Senate. Harris had a very short period of time in the Senate. She did, like I don't know what her like sort of core brand proposition was as vice president. She wasn't running. She wasn't, I don't know if many vice presidents actually have like, this is what they're known for. I don't know. David Dayen described it to me 3 or 4 weeks ago as, Harris is a jump ball. If that's the case, if it is not, if this sort of like, and, she does seem, she's nibbling at the edges of the antitrust stuff. Like,
Right.
the small business could arguably be, grant that she's coming out with today. The tax incentive is at least sort of like an anti-corporate, more sort of like competition focused type of thing, but that can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. The labor stuff still seems to be sort of something that she's pursuing.
I mean, my hope here's my hope. My hope is that Donald Trump loses, that in a Harris administration, that they pick a couple of really big, easy to understand, simple things that are wildly popular. Tim Walz, right before he was put on the ticket, was asked by the New York Times, Ezra Klein, what's your top priority? What do you think the Democrats should do if they win in 2024? And he said, paid family and medical leave. That's something that everybody in the country can understand. It's wildly popular among voters of both parties. It's not we've never tried it before. Various states have versions of this. The point is, pick a couple of things like that you can hold up as first of all, cudgels against the Republicans in the Senate and the House, where you can shame them. You can use it as a political tool to prove which side they're on, and potentially get it passed. And when you get it passed, it's something that's very easy for everyone to understand what it is, right? I mean, I think the Democrats in recent times have done a lot of things.
And an issue like that becomes an avatar for like a broader caring economy. And you can build off of that.
Yes, and I think the part of the thing that's happened to Democrats that's been a problem for them in the last 10, 15, 20 years is their accomplishments are not simple to understand. Okay, like the Affordable Care Act, you're like, well, that's like, but my health care is still going up, and what actually is the ACA? And the pre-existing condition things are good, and there's some good stuff in there, but it's kind of vague, right? Like even the American Rescue Plan, which I think is one of the best things Biden did. It's like, well, it did some unemployment stuff, but then it expired. And the antitrust stuff, super important. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau stuff, super important. But it's also you got to be kind of paying attention to it, right? Like, hey, I just got paid family and medical leave because the president and the White House did something. Like, everyone can understand that. I think the Democrats sort of fetishizing complexity, and whether it's means testing or whether it's sort of these things that are so complex the average person can't understand it. So my advice to Kamala Harris, not that she's asking, would be pick a couple of things that are super simple, super necessary, super popular, and easy for everyone to understand.
Yeah, I agree with that. Where do you think we are relative? I mean, again, you and I have been having these conversations for, literally 20 years.
Yeah.
But where do you think we are with this Democratic Party relative to where we were in like 2004, 2005?
Oh, I mean, look, I think Joe Biden has, I think, really one special skill. It's not even really such an amazing skill, but it's an important skill, which is knowing where the center of the Democratic Party is and positioning himself there. And so I want to go back to what you said earlier about how, Biden did all that, he did the American Rescue Plan, the antitrust stuff, the pro-labor stuff, the CFPB regulatory stuff.
The IRA.
Right, again, right? Yeah, exactly. The IRA. Okay, that was kind of a surprise. And I agree, because like we looked at Joe Biden, we looked at what he'd done for 40, 50 years, and we presumed that what Joe Biden did for 40 or 50 years was because Joe Biden was a conservative corporate Democrat. And I think there's some truth to that in those periods of time. And it's not to say Joe Biden was perfect as president, but it is to say that the analysis actually is probably that Joe Biden had those corporate politics in the past, as much because of his own ideology as because that's where the center of the party was. And so what explains why he, on economic policy, has been so much better than the Obama administration and President Obama and what they proposed is because the center of the party actually has moved. And that is because of a whole lot of organizing, a whole lot of pressure, a whole lot of awareness that, for instance, what happened after when hope and change became more of the same after the financial crisis, that was unacceptable. And so I don't necessarily believe in this permanent ratchet effect, like the Democrats are always moving right and the Republicans are moving farther right and the whole set. Like, I think, if you look from where Bill Clinton was, like Mr. Welfare Reform, Mr. The era of big government is over, through Obama, we're going to bail out the banks and let 10 million people get foreclosed on, to where Joe Biden was with his economic policy. That's not a ratchet effect trajectory. That's actually the hard work of changing the party actually has paid off. Now, I think the huge question policy-wise for if Harris wins is, does she go back to basically Obamaism, or does she stick with this sort of where Biden is, or Biden
the Biden
was,
trajectory,
the Biden trajectory, right? That's a different trajectory. And I think if like that trajectory gets another 4 years or 8 years, it's not a perfect fix. It's not a panacea. It doesn't mean everything's solved, but that's better than going back to Obamaism. That's better than going back to the era of big government is over Clintonism.
100%. And I think that's why fights over like Lena Khan at this point, which seem sort of small, are much bigger, I think,
huge,
than
because there's signals. There's signals where she and they want to go.
And it's basically our opportunity, and I'm not exactly sure who the "our" is in that phrase, frankly, but to say there are certain areas where if you tread, you're going to get blowback, and we're going to make it costly for you in terms of like your resources, your and you don't want it to. I mean, and that's the way I think, it doesn't work with all the issues, certainly. But it works with some, I think. And, I don't know. I'm always recall like 3 million comments was what it took to make Barack Obama's, his FCC chair, who was a former like Verizon executive. I can't remember the exact details. Basically say, okay, fine, net neutrality. And, it's 1% of people sending in just email comment, and it turned that around. Was, I think, very instructive to me. But
well, I mean, it goes back to the old idea that I'm going to butcher the phrase, but it's never underestimate how much a relatively small but motivated group of people can accomplish. I mean, small meaning it's still millions of people. But by the way, to bring it all the way back to master plan, they fundamentally understood that principle too. Yep. That over a long enough period of time, a relatively small group of people can change the entire trajectory of the world. And I think that has happened at some level in the Democratic Party to make people like Joe Biden, right, Mr. Corporate Democrat from 20 years ago, be the guy who put Lena Khan in, made an aggressive CFPB, has the best labor policy in at least 40, 50 years. I mean, that didn't happen because Joe Biden woke up one day and was like, I'm going to be a nice guy now, right? That happened because he was a career politician who always knew where the center of the party was. So I think people listening to this, it's not to say like, oh, I hope Kamala Harris wakes up in the morning and is like going to be a nice person. No, it's that the work of holding her to where the new center of the party is an ongoing amount of work. It's all sorts of that pressure, elections, organizing, et cetera, et cetera. That work, sometimes it doesn't feel like it's like a direct one-to-one payoff, but clearly if you like zoom out a little bit, right, that trajectory change from Obama to Biden, that is huge. It's huge.
All right, lastly, but the one thing, and I wonder what replaces this. Biden could look at the center of the party, and he's not like looking at the center of the party by like I'm gonna watch Democracy Now and Morning Joe, and I'll go somewhere in the middle or something to that effect. He's looking at like, okay, Bernie Sanders commanded this many votes, Elizabeth Warren commanded this many votes. The rest of the field couldn't even get to I see what's going on here. And that's the way that he made that assessment. I that's what I imagine. Like, right. I mean, they felt the threat of Bernie Sanders. I mean, Obama had to swoop in and basically cut deals with everybody and try and bring the party together. And they didn't want Biden. Like, I don't think they wanted Biden, but Biden was the only one who could do it as far as they could see in terms of like being that sort of like a candidate, the anybody but Bernie candidate. And what replicates that in the absence of a primary that indicates this? I mean, what becomes the evidence for that?
It's a great question. And the other concern I have with Democratic Party culture right now is that especially with Trump, is that the Democratic parties, I'm talking about the sort of activist culture, the culture of rank and file voters, is unify behind the dear leader. Never question. The questioning, the pressuring is the president is bad and dangerous and disloyal. I think Trump, him being the Republican Party leader, has helped suppress that dissent. But I think after Trump is gone, knock on wood, fingers crossed, after the election, he's gone as a force. I think that it will be, the question is whether that culture will change and whether the constituencies of the Democratic Party are willing to continue to make demands on the new administration. And look, yes, there'll be a political calculus from a Harris administration. Do we agree to those demands, or do we go back to the politics of punching left? I mean, I think that's what we've been circling around. Obama's political calculus was, I create quote unquote centrist branding and centrist credibility by periodically punching left.
Yep.
I think Biden has, in a sense, not really done that. I mean, and I think the question for Harris, sort of political branding wise, is, does she see Biden's formula as the way to do, build the coalition? Even when I don't agree with the coalition, I don't put my finger in the eye of the base of the Democratic Party, or does she revert back to the kind of triangulating politics of Clinton and Obama? And I'll just leave you with this. I think if Joe Biden, one of the ultimate triangulators of the 1990s and 2000s politics, if even Mr. Triangulator can come to a different political equation, then so too can someone like Kamala Harris.
Yep. David Sirota, founder, editor-in-chief of The Lever, or The Lever for you Americans, host of the new investigative podcast, Meister Plan, or Master Plan, as we call it. We'll put a link to the podcast. It's really fascinating stuff. I'm glad you guys are doing this. And of course, we'll link to the Lever, which is a daily read for me. David, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much. Really great to see you. Thanks, Ian.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.